All right. Good evening. Let me grab a drink. This entire winter, I have been struggling with problems with my throat, with my voice, and those issues are still here this evening. So I have my cough drops, I have a drink, and we'll see if I can make it through the evening without losing my voice. So, first of all, I want to thank everybody that's here this evening, whether you're here live while this event is taking place or whether you're joining later when this video is posted to one of my social media platforms. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for your participation, and I want to invite you, whether you're live this evening or whether you're watching later, if you end up with comments or questions, I'd encourage you to place those in the chat, even if you're doing that at where this has been posted. I check those and I try to respond to those whenever I can. If you're responding to the recorded deal, then I'll respond to you as I can, or you may want to shoot me the question either on Facebook Messenger or in my email, and I'd be happy to respond. All right, couple things to get us going this evening. First of all, if you join live and you don't mind, stick in the comments where you're checking in from, where you're viewing from. Same in if you're watching later, I'm interested in knowing where people are watching from, where they're checking in from. And I would appreciate that if you could give me that information. I also want to let you know, in the past, I have had guests here with me on Tuesday evenings. In the past, I was trying to have a guest once a month or so. And hey, Blast, man, good to see you here, dude. In the past, I've tried to have guests here with me, and guests will be starting again this month in March. In fact, next week, I'll have a guest here with me on the live. Her name is Betsy Wright. Betsy is a friend of mine. Betsy has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. She has worked as a court-appointed advocate, and for a number of years now, she has worked for Prison Fellowship, which is the largest prison ministry here in the United States. And she works providing care for children and families of those who are incarcerated. She also, about 4 years ago, became what's known as a trust-based, I got to read this because I can't remember all these things, a trust-based relational intervention practitioner, and which works specifically, means that they're certified professional trained to implement trauma-informed attachment-based approach and care for children from hard places, from experiences like abuse, neglect, and trauma. And Betsy is what I would call an expert, what most people who know her would call an expert in the area of trauma. And Betsy will be here with me next week. We'll be talking about trauma, a definition of trauma, what trauma is, how it affects us, and what it does to us, what it does in our body, and what are some ways that we can overcome trauma and deal with trauma in the present. And so that will be taking place next week. Coming up in April, I have an officer from a local police department, and he'll be here with me in April to talk about the relationship between addiction and crime. And in the police department he's a part of, he works specifically with a team that is assigned to address crime in the homeless population. And he'll be talking about the relationship between homelessness and addiction. And he'll be here in April. And then coming up later, I'll have a pastor and a leader from his church, somebody from his church who leads an addiction group and a program in the church. I'll have the pastor and the group leader on to talk about the role that the church can play in the area of recovery and the responsibility that's there for the church to reach out and to minister in that area of need. So yes, coming up the next few months, and talking with some others for down the road as we move on through the summer. And so I'd like for you to consider coming back, being here next week. If you can, in the live with all of my guests in the live, and even when it's just me, you are welcome to ask questions and to comment on what we're talking about. You're free to do that tonight. And we would like that. So if you have questions about trauma, be here next week. If you know somebody that is a survivor of trauma, and trauma is creating struggles in their life currently, man, invite them to join you and show up here next week. As Betsy and I have a discussion, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions if you'd like. So that's a little bit of an opening. Now, let's begin to take a look at our topic this evening. And what I want to do is I want to start with a quote that I posted this past week. It's a quote from Brene Brown, and you may be familiar with her. It's a quote from her and then a comment that I posted on that quote. That's where I want to start this evening. So let me read that to you. The quote from Brene says, "Talk to yourself like you'd talk to someone you love." Talk to yourself like you would talk to someone you love. And then the comment that I made on that was that most of the men that I work with would never speak to a friend the way they speak to themselves. The internal voice that we use most of the time is harsh. It's accusing. It's relentless. We say things like, "You should be further along by now." And, "What's wrong with you? You're never going to change." But growth doesn't happen in an atmosphere of contempt. And that's what those kind of statements are conveying, self-contempt. Growth happens in an atmosphere of safety. Self-compassion is not weakness. Self-compassion is fuel for change. If you wouldn't say what you're saying to someone you love, then why are you saying it to yourself? That was my comment based on Brene's quote. And so what I want to talk about tonight is I want to talk about, trying not to be too religious here, I want to talk about shame and grace. And I want to start tonight with a personal confession. Many of you know that I was in the ministry for 20 plus years in various forms. And for all those years in the ministry, I preached, man, I couldn't even count how many sermons I preached on grace. The importance of grace, the gift of grace. But what I actually lived towards myself and towards others was shame. I presented shame. I believed that grace brings us to Christ, but shame is what causes change. That's the way I interacted with myself. That's the way I interacted with others. If I shame myself enough, I'll get my act together. If I shame somebody else enough, they'll get their act together. And what I have found, what I've recognized, in a lot of those years, even while I was in ministry, I was living in active addiction. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, shame does not produce long-term change. It does not. What I've experienced, what I've witnessed is that many people in recovery live with that same tension. We're in recovery, but we scream at ourselves with a voice of condemnation and a voice of criticism. What we practice and what we believe in our heart is, if I shame myself enough, I will change. A lot of people, probably the majority of people in recovery at one point or another, live with that same tension. And maybe I'm wrong. I'm speaking from my experience as a man. I think that men are very prone to that approach, that idea of shame, shaming ourselves, attempting to shame ourselves into change. Now, here's my main thought for tonight and what I'm going to build on. And feel free this evening, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, stick them into the chat here. But here's what I'm going to build on, what I'm going to take a look at tonight. And it's the idea that shame can produce short-term change. But shame never produces long-term transformation. It isn't possible. So let's start by taking a look for a few minutes at the shame-based change model and how that works. For many of us, what we were taught, what we learned growing up, what we learned in our families of origin was, and we were taught this sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but what we were taught was, if we feel bad enough, we won't repeat the behavior. We were taught that fear keeps us sober or keeps us acting right. Intensity equals repentance. And we were taught this idea that self-criticism equals accountability. Now, here's the way that that shows up in our life. We talk to ourselves, we make statements to ourselves like, man, you are so disgusting. You know, you're never going to change. You're never going to change. Dude, you should know better. And here's one, man. We tell ourselves that we deserve to suffer. When things go wrong, we deserve what we get because we're so screwed up. So that shame creates an internal dialogue with ourselves where we talk down to ourselves. We beat ourselves up. And we do that because we're convinced that it's the right thing to do. It seems to feel right. When we talk to ourselves as men, man, we think we're being manly. I'm taking responsibility. I'm being tough. We talk to ourselves like that, and we convince ourselves that we're being strong. We convince ourselves that we're taking our behavior seriously. If we are a religious person, we tell ourselves we're taking sin seriously. And it feels like we're being accountable. But what we need to understand is what actually happens when we experience shame and what shame does to our brain, how we respond to it. So, the way that shame impacts our brain is that our nervous system, when we experience shame, shame activates the threat system. And we've talked a little bit in the past about some of the brain science that's involved in our brain and in our behaviors. And so brain, that shame, man, I'm old, mixing up my words here. Shame activates the threat system. What it's doing really is it's triggering the amygdala. It's telling us when we experience shame, it tells us that life's not safe, the world's not safe. It activates the threat system. And when we sense that threat activates the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part of our brain that begins producing brain chemicals, stress hormones, that activate our body and kick us into a state of alertness or awareness. And it activates the brainstem, that fight or flight mode in our body. We experience shame and we respond very much the same as when we experience fear. We become highly alert. Our frontal lobes are rational thinking. We do what's called flipping our lid. Our frontal lobes begin to go offline. And we lose the ability to be able to think clearly and to be able to think rationally. Stress narrows our thinking. It puts us on alert status. We're ready to fight. And then our brain kicks into a mode where it begins to search for relief. And that's where this all plays into our addiction cycle. When we start looking for relief. So there's a pattern that's taking place here, an addiction pattern, a cycle. And here's the way it looks. We slip up. We're not perfect in our behaviors, and we slip. We don't have a full-blown relapse, but we think about it, or we get tempted or triggered in a way. We don't give into it. We don't relapse, but that slip triggers shame. And we begin that negative self-talk. Dude, you are so stupid. Why is it that still bothers you? You ought to be so much further than that. You know what? You're never going to get over this. And that shame triggers that self-attack mode where we begin to beat ourselves up and to beat ourselves down. Can you relate to that? Have you ever experienced that? You have the slightest slip and you start down the spiral of negative self-talk where you beat yourself up. And as we begin that, what that behavior does is it begins to push us into isolation. We begin to move into isolation because we have a fear of exposure. One of the biggest fears that we as addicts have is of exposure. We're afraid somebody's going to see that we don't have it all together. And we begin to move into isolation. And what's that quote about isolation? Doesn't use the word isolation specifically, but that catchphrase in the addiction world today, which is so true when we stop and think about it, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is healthy community. And I have found that to be true. Most of us have found that to be true. It's when we begin to experience healthy community, whether it's through a group meeting, whether it's through church, whether it's building a small community of men where we have the freedom to be open and honest. But in shame and in self-attack mode, we move towards isolation. And when we move towards isolation, those negative feelings ramp up inside of our brain, inside of our body, and we begin to look for relief. And here's where that cycle begins, that rotation and that downward spiral. As we begin to seek relief, we're in that self-condemnation mode, that self-attack, that isolation. We begin to seek relief and we begin to act out through the very behaviors that we hate so much. It can be drugs, it can be alcohol, it can be unhealthy sexual behavior, it can be a million different things. But we begin to act out. And what happens when we begin to act out? We're starting that cycle all over again. The shame ramps up, the self-attack ramps up, and we've entered that spiral. Can you relate to what I'm saying here? Have you ever experienced that? So, what does shame produce in us? When we experience shame, shame pushes us to short-term behavior suppression or short-term behavioral change. In shame, we clamp down. What we're really doing is we make an attempt to white knuckle. In shame, we convince ourselves, I can make myself act differently. You know, throughout a question, my sponsor used to ask me all the time, how's that working for you? How's that worked for you in the past? So shame produces short-term behavior suppression. Shame produces an attempt at compliance. Now, I got to tell you, I hate the word compliance. The word compliance triggers me. I hate it. What does compliance mean? Compliance is when we start trying to do what's expected of us in order to avoid consequences, conflict, or disapproval, instead of doing it because we really believe it's the right thing to do. We don't care if it's the right thing to do or not. Compliance means we're doing it just to avoid consequences. And compliance is never healthy. Shame produces fear-based restraint. We're trying to change behavior related to fear, a fear of exposure, a fear of we're already experiencing self-shame, a fear of shame from others. And it pushes us into an external form of image management. We're not trying to change, we're not trying to transform who we are. We're trying to control how people see us. The focus now has nothing to do with real internal change. It has to do with looking good. Image management. Now, here's what shame doesn't produce. Shame it cannot produce secure identity. It can't do it. Shame cannot produce emotional regulation. That's why it pushes us towards seeking some kind of external relief. Shame cannot produce honest confession because in shame, our move is to hide, not to live and walk in honesty. And shame can never produce sustainable change. It can produce short-term change, short-term, but never long-term. So the question we might ask is, why does shame work in the short term? And there are some reasons, and we can take a look at these really quick. Shame shocks our system. All of a sudden, when we experience shame, we become aware of exposure, the possibility that people are going to see who we really are. That's what we're thinking. And it shocks our system. And that shock creates a sense of fear. Fear becomes our motivation in everything we do. Maybe we're experiencing shame, and somebody speaks to us and says, "Hey man, are you doing okay? You look like you're struggling." And how do we normally respond to that, especially when we're caught up in shame, when we're caught up in fear? We lie like crazy. "Nah, man, life is great. No problems. No problems. Everything's good with me." It creates fear. And fear generates lies and deception. And that fear, that shame, suppresses the behavior temporarily. It does it through white knuckling, through an attempt to use willpower to overcome the behavior. Now, again, I can ask, how many times has willpower worked successfully for you? Has it ever? I know the answer is it hasn't worked in the long term, not for any of us. Willpower can maybe help us to change one unhealthy behavior for another unhealthy behavior, but it doesn't bring transformation. And the reason it doesn't is because eventually the nervous system burns out. We just get tired. We've got those white knuckles hanging on the edge of that cliff, and we can only hang on for so long. And then we lose our grip and we fall. Resentment, when we're white knuckling, when we're hanging on, when we're motivated by shame, resentment builds. Now, I don't know whether you're a fan of the 12 steps or not, but Bill W. says that resentment is the number one problem. Resentment drives more alcoholics to relapse than anything else in their lives. And I believe that to be true. We become resentful. Secrecy increases. We begin to lie. And we don't lie just about big things. We lie about everything in an attempt to hide who we are. And all of a sudden, the behavior resurfaces. Excuse me. My voice acting up again. So, shame restrains behavior temporarily. But sooner or later, that behavior resurfaces. That behavior comes back. Grace, on the other hand, grace transforms identity. Shame restrains behavior. Grace reforms identity. So when it comes to living in shame, there's a cost there for us. There's a personal cost, there's a relational cost, and there's a recovery cost. And a personal cost for living in shame is we move to that harsh internal dialogue that I've talked about. We tell ourselves, "You are so stupid. You are such a failure. You're never going to change." A part of the personal cost is exhaustion. We wear ourselves out trying to white knuckle it. In that personal cost, we experience performance-driven spirituality. We begin to think that we have to perform. It moves back to that idea of looking good. And it produces a fear of exposure. We walk around constantly. I believe in recovery. I always tell my clients, when we put together a personal recovery plan, one of the things I encourage them to do is to come up with a selfish reason for recovery. And by selfish reason, we think about a selfish reason actually being something positive. What I'm talking about there is that a lot of us enter recovery for our spouse or for our kids or to save our job. But if I enter into recovery for my spouse and we have an argument, then my reason for recovery is out the window and I've set myself up to relapse again. So we come up with a reason for recovery that's focused on me. And for years now, my personal reason, my selfish reason for recovery has been based on that fear of exposure. I remember I told you, I started by telling you I was in the ministry for 20 some years. And I was in active addiction in a lot of that time. And I can remember standing in the pulpit in the middle of a sentence, and the thought would cross my mind, if these people knew what you were doing last night, man, they'd stone you. They'd throw you out. You'd be out of a job. They'd hate you. They'd never speak to you again. Fear of exposure. I don't intend to ever experience that again. Never. So there's a personal cost when we live in shame. There's a relational cost. When we are living in shame, we get hard on others. When we're shaming ourselves, many times we turn that on the people that are around us. We become quick to correct others and to speak down to others, to call them out for things that we see as shortcomings. We develop a low tolerance for weakness. Addicts by nature are perfectionists. And I've talked about that before in some blogs. I'm not going to get into that really deep, but we are perfectionists. We try to hold ourselves to a level of perfection, and we try to force perfectionism on everybody around us. We get a low tolerance for weakness in ourselves and in others. And as a relational cost, we struggle with offering compassion to those that are around us. So a relational cost. And then finally, there's a recovery cost. When we are living in shame, we practice delayed disclosure if we disclose at all. We don't talk to anybody about our struggles. We don't talk about our slips or our relapse. We hold that close. We're not open. We're not honest. We hide relapse. We white knuckle. And we live a life of inconsistent sobriety. So let's take a change here and let's look at the idea of grace. I want to share a verse with you, man. It's become my favorite verse maybe in the whole Bible. And based on that idea that for most of my life, I thought shame produced change. And then one day, as I was reading through my Bible, I came across Romans 2:4. And this is my paraphrased version, but you need to go look at this for yourself. Romans chapter 2, verse 4. It says, "Do you not understand that it's the kindness of God that leads to repentance?" The kindness of God that leads to repentance. It's when we see God's kindness, when we recognize his love for us, even in the midst of our failure and acting out. That's what gives me the motivation and the desire to change. I think about that in relation to my grandkids. They can be in their room destroying things, and I can go in and I can yell at them. I can shame them. I can get after them. And the behavior will change while I'm standing there, but my grandkids are young. And I get after them, and the behavior stops, and I turn and head back towards my chair in the living room. And before I get there again, I hear the behavior start back up. Why is that? It's because I'm trying to use shame to motivate change in their lives. But when I use grace, when I use kindness, when I sit down on the floor and play with them for a while, when I explain to them, you keep jumping on this bed, you're going to break the lamp, you're going to get hurt. And when I love them and when they recognize that I love them, and they begin to connect the idea that what I'm asking is out of that love, they begin to change behavior in response to that kindness and to that care. So let's talk for a minute about what grace is not, because some of us get confused about these things. First of all, grace is not permissiveness. It's not the idea, we'll just go ahead and do it. It's not a big deal anyway. It's not, grace is not minimizing the harm. My behavior over the years and my addiction caused a tremendous amount of harm, To many people, it resulted in me being locked up for 2 years. And I've talked about this before. I have 4 daughters. I have one daughter that still has really nothing to do with me. And it's been many years since I was in prison. But I caused a tremendous amount of harm there. While my heart aches, I can't be angry because she doesn't have anything to do with me, because I caused harm. Grace doesn't minimize harm. Grace doesn't ignore consequences. I served 2 years in prison, and you know what? I deserved it. I did deserve it. I did some terrible things. Grace is not excusing sin. So what is grace? So grace is secure attachment. Grace is learning how to have healthy relationship, how to live in healthy relationship with others. The idea that I can trust and that I can be trusted. The idea that I have value. Grace is safety in truth. Safety and truth. When I was in jail waiting to go to trial, a friend of mine, Rob, came to visit me. And man, I was actually at the time in protective custody. I was locked in a cell 23 hours a day. I got out an hour to get a shower and to walk the day room. And man, I was all over the news, and Rob came to visit me. And I made a statement to him. I said, Rob, this is going to sound crazy. I'm sitting here in a jail cell, and it was a video visit. I said, this is going to sound crazy, but I feel more freedom right now today than I've felt in years, because I'm not hiding anything anymore. I'm not afraid of exposure. There's nothing left. It's all over the news. Everything is out there. I don't have anything to hide, and that's freedom. There's safety in truth. Grace is being fully known and not discarded. One of the biggest fears that all of us struggle with is that idea of, if people really knew me, they wouldn't want anything to do with me. Have you ever thought that? Have you? That's a big struggle for the majority of us, if not all of us, at some point in our life. If people really knew me, they wouldn't want anything to do with me. Grace is the ability to be fully known and not discarded, still loved, still cared for. And grace is accountability without contempt. That goes back to how we talk to ourselves. That idea where we scream either out loud or in our mind, "You are so stupid. You're so dumb. You're such a failure. You're never going to change." That's self-contempt. Self-contempt, and contempt is dangerous. Grace produces change because we feel safe. When somebody feels safe, we're quicker to confess. We're quicker to be honest, to stand up, and to be open. When somebody feels safe, we reach out earlier. We become ready to say, "Hey man, I'm struggling. I need some help. Can we talk?" I was down at the coffee shop today and somebody shot me a text. "Hey man, are you free? Can we talk for a while?" That's a sign that he felt safe. And I do that. Here just in the last couple weeks, I had a phone call that really had me activated, really had me triggered. And I reached out to a friend. "Man, can we talk?" And it was late at night, but man, he responded first thing the next morning. And we were able to talk and work through things. We reach out quicker. When somebody feels safe, we repair more honestly. We're willing to admit our mistakes. You know what? None of us are perfect. Nobody is perfect. All of us make mistakes. There are times when I lose my temper. There are times when I say things. Sometimes I even believe what I'm saying is true, and then I find out I'm wrong. We make repair more honestly. When we feel safe, we have the freedom to come back and say, "You know what? I screwed up. I'm sorry. I snapped at you. I didn't tell the truth. When I said that, I was wrong." And I own that. And when somebody feels safe, we stay engaged. We continue to talk. We continue to reach out. We continue to be real with one another. And real transformation happens when we feel safe enough to tell the truth. So, really quick here, a clear contrast of shame versus grace. When we're living in shame, shame says, sometimes shame screams out loud or just in our heads. Shame screams, "You're the problem." But that finger's pointed at me. "You disgust me. You will never change. You need to run and hide." That's shame. Grace, on the other hand, says, "Hey, you did something harmful." It's honest. But it goes on to say, "But that's not who you are. Let's repair it. Let's make things right." And grace stays present, stays interactive in the conversation. Shame attacks identity. It attacks who we are. It tells us we're a failure. Grace addresses behavior. Grace says, yes, you did do that, but you can change. You don't have to do that again. Now, I've got a few questions for you. You can answer them in the comments here. You can answer them to yourself sitting there at home, but I'd encourage you to answer them. Here's my questions. First of all, what does your inner critic sound like? Is it quick to scream, "See, you are a failure. See, you're never going to change"? Is that what you hear in your head when you make a mistake? What does your inner critic sound like? If you spoke to someone that you sponsor, some of you may be sponsors for other people. I know in Samson Society they have Silas's. Maybe you just have friends that you talk to that are struggling and that are in recovery. If you spoke to one of them, the way you speak to yourself, what would happen? What would happen? We speak to ourselves in ways that we would never speak to anybody else. Recently, I was talking with somebody, and man, we hold on to things forever. When we live in shame, we hold on to things forever. I was talking to a guy recently, not quite as old as I am, and I was talking to him, and he was talking to me about something that took place when he was 11 or 12 years old. And he was still holding on to shame from that, beating himself up. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I was so stupid. I can't believe I was such a coward. But as this guy was talking to me, man, I know that he has a grandson that's about the same age. And I stopped him and asked him, I said, what would you say to your grandson if he faced a situation like that? Would you tell your grandson, you are so stupid? You are such a miserable waste of flesh. You know, you're never going to be any better than this. You're only going to get worse. Is that the way you would talk to your grandson? And he looked at me with a shocked expression on his face. And he said, no, there's no way. He's young. He has to learn how to handle those things, man. I wouldn't talk to him like that. And I challenged him. Why do you talk to yourself like that? Why do you tolerate from yourself what you would never tolerate from somebody else and what you would never lay on somebody else? So question number one, what does your inner critic sound like? Question number two, if you spoke to someone that you sponsor or somebody that you care about, the way that you talk to yourself, what would happen? And then question number three, what would it sound like to correct yourself and to speak to yourself without contempt, without hatred for yourself? You know, it is possible for us to take our behavior seriously without hating ourselves, without practicing self-contempt. I want to come back to, I'm about to wrap up. We're going to get done a little bit early tonight, but I want to come back to the quote that I began with from Brene Brown. And that quote was this: talk to yourself like you would talk to someone you love. Here's my closing thought for you. Shame may control you for a season. For a while, shame may be that first initial response that kicks in when you struggle, when something happens. Shame may control for a season, but grace for yourself, self-love, self-compassion will transform you for a lifetime. Again, if you have comments, if you have questions, you're free to put them in the chat here. You can message me on Facebook. You can go to my website, rw-coaching.com. You can shoot me an email. If you have questions or comments, feel free to send those. If you feel like it, let me know where you're checking in from. If this has spoken to you this evening, I'd ask that you would share it with somebody. And just as a reminder, coming up next week, I'll have a guest here with me. Her name is Betsy Wright. She is an expert on trauma, and we'll be talking about trauma. We'll lay out a definition. A lot of people believe that trauma is always something like physical abuse, sexual abuse, something of that nature. But we're going to talk about what is trauma, really. We'll talk about what it does to us, how we respond to it, how our body responds to it, and what are some tools and some steps we can take to experience freedom. She'll be my guest next week. Coming up in April, I'll have a guest from Louisville Police Department. We'll be discussing the role of addiction and crime, and specifically addiction and homelessness. He works with a group that's assigned to work with the homeless community in Louisville. We'll discuss that. And then coming up later, I'll have as a guest a pastor and the gentleman from his congregation that leads a recovery program in their church. And we'll discuss the role and the responsibility that the church has when it comes to recovery. So thank you for being with me tonight. Let's Talk Recovery. Be back here next Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Betsy Wright will be here with me to talk about trauma. This will be up for, I believe, 30 days on Facebook. But here later this evening, this video will be up on some of my other social media platforms. It'll be up on YouTube, RW Coaching on YouTube. And yeah, I appreciate you being here tonight or in the replay if you're watching from the replay. And I will be back next Tuesday evening, joined by my guest, Betsy Wright, as we talk about trauma on Let's Talk Recovery. Have a good evening.